small town of Millbrook was known for its picturesque landscapes, friendly locals, and old-fashioned charm. However, beneath the surface lay a dark secret, one that had been buried deep within the town's history for generations. Nobody spoke of it. Nobody dared to acknowledge its existence. But one fateful day, that secret would be unearthed, and the townspeople would realize the true horror that had been lurking in their midst all along. It started with a strange smell, a putrid odor that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. At first, people thought it was just a dead animal or some kind of natural occurrence, but the smell persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. And then, people started disappearing. The first was a young girl, only 10 years old, who had gone out to play in the woods and never returned. Her parents searched high and low, but there was no trace of her. And then, a young couple who had been out for a late-night walk vanished without a trace. The town was in a panic, and the police were at a loss as to what was happening. But there was one man who knew the truth. His name was James, and he had grown up in Millbrook, hearing the stories that nobody else dared to speak of. He knew that the town was built on a burial ground, a place where the dead were laid to rest long before the town was even founded. And he knew that something had awakened from that ancient grave, something that had been dormant for far too long. As the smell grew stronger and the disappearances continued, James knew that he had to take action. He gathered a group of like-minded individuals, people who were willing to face the horror head-on. They armed themselves with shovels and flashlights and made their way to the burial ground, determined to put an end to the terror once and for all. What they found there was beyond their wildest nightmares. The earth was cracked and split, and a foul mist rose from the ground, stinging their eyes and burning their throats. And then they saw it, a figure, hunched over and twisted, with eyes that burned like hot coals. It was the embodiment of the town's dark secret, the thing that had been unleashed from its ancient grave. James and his companions fought bravely, but they were no match for the horror that had been unleashed. One by one, they fell, until only James was left standing. He looked into the eyes of the monster and knew that he was going to die. But he also knew that he had to try, for the sake of the town, for the sake of the innocent lives that had been lost. And so, with all his strength, he swung his shovel at the creature's head. The impact sent a shockwave through his body, but he didn't stop. He kept swinging again and again, until finally, the creature fell to the ground, motionless. James collapsed to his knees, exhausted and injured, but he also knew that he had saved the town. He had put an end to the horror that had been lurking in the shadows for so long, and he knew that, no matter what happened next, he had done the right thing. Little did he know that the battle was far from over. The darkness that had been unleashed would spread, infecting the town and its people. And soon, Millbrook would become a place of true horror, a place where the dead walked and the living prayed for mercy. James stumbled back to town, his body battered and bruised. He was the only one who had made it out of the burial ground alive, but he knew that he was not unscathed. The horror that he had faced had left a mark on his soul, and he could feel it gnawing away at his sanity. As he walked through the deserted streets, he saw the signs of the terror that had spread throughout the town. Houses were abandoned, their doors hanging open and their windows shattered. The streets were littered with debris, and a thick fog had settled over everything, obscuring the few remaining street lights. James knew that he had to find a way to stop the horror, to put an end to the darkness that had descended on his hometown. He searched through his memories, trying to remember anything that could help him. And then, he remembered an old legend that his grandfather used to tell him when he was a boy. The legend spoke of a sacred tree, one that had grown from the tears of a grieving mother. The tree was said to have the power to banish evil, to purify the land and restore balance to the natural order. James set out to find the tree, knowing that it was his last hope. He walked for hours, following the memory of his grandfather's words. And finally, he found it. The tree was enormous, its branches reaching up to the sky like fingers of fire. Its trunk was thick and gnarled, and its roots dug deep into the earth. James could feel the power of the tree, and he knew that it was the only thing that could save the town. He reached out and touched the bark of the tree, and as he did, he felt a surge of energy flow through his body. He closed his eyes and focused, willing the power of the tree to flow through him. And then he heard it, a soft rustling in the leaves, a whisper on the wind. He opened his eyes, and there, standing before him, was the monster that he had thought he had killed. The creature's eyes burned with a cold fire, and its mouth twisted into a malevolent grin. James knew that he was in trouble, that the darkness had caught up with him at last. But he also knew that he had the power of the tree behind him. He raised his hands and called forth the power, willing it to banish the darkness once and for all. And then, the world exploded into light. James felt a surge of energy, a blinding flash that tore through the night. And when the light faded, he was alone, standing before the tree. The darkness banished at last. He collapsed to the ground, spent and exhausted. But he also knew that he had saved the town. He had banished the darkness, restored balance to the natural order, and ensured that Millbrook would be a place of peace once more. But as he lay there, he knew that the horror would always be with him, a shadow that would follow him to the end of his days. And he wondered if the cost of victory had been too high, if the price of banishing the darkness had been his own soul. For months after the incident, James tried to forget what had happened. He tried to go back to his normal life, to live like nothing had changed. But he knew that it was impossible. The horror had left a mark on him, one that would never fade. He started to see things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, whispers on the wind that he couldn't quite make out. He knew that the darkness was still out there, somewhere, waiting for its chance to strike again. And then, the nightmare started. Every night, he would dream of the creature, its burning eyes and twisted grin. He would dream of the town, engulfed in flames, the dead rising from their graves. He tried to ignore the dreams, to push them away, but they only grew worse. And then, one night, he woke up to find that he was no longer alone. The creature stood at the foot of his bed, its eyes burning with a malevolent light. James froze, unable to move, unable to speak. The creature grinned, its teeth flashing in the darkness. "I've come for you, James," it said, its voice a hiss. "I've come to take you back to the darkness." James tried to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The creature reached out, its fingers brushing against his skin, and he felt a surge of cold energy flow through him. And then, the creature was gone, leaving James alone in the darkness. He knew that he had to do something, that he couldn't live like this anymore. And so, he returned to the burial ground, to the sacred tree that had saved the town. He reached out and touched the bark, and as he did, he felt the power flow through him once more. He closed his eyes and focused, willing the power to banish the darkness once and for all. And then, he heard it, a soft rustling in the leaves, a whisper on the wind. He opened his eyes, and there, standing before him, was the creature that had haunted his dreams. But this time, James was ready. He raised his hands, calling forth the power of the tree, and unleashed it on the creature. The creature howled, its body writhing in pain. But James didn't stop. He kept calling forth the power, pouring it into the creature until it finally collapsed, motionless. James collapsed to the ground, spent and exhausted. But he also knew that he had banished the darkness once and for all. He had saved himself, and he had saved the town. And as he lay there, he knew that he would never forget the horror that he had faced. It would always be with him, a shadow that would follow him for the rest of his days. But he also knew that he was stronger than the darkness, and that he would always have the power of the tree to protect him. Years passed, and James grew old. He became a recluse, living alone in the old family house on the edge of town. He rarely ventured out, and when he did, he always made sure to stay away from the burial ground and the sacred tree. But even in his old age, he could still feel the horror that he had faced. He could still see the burning eyes of the creature, hear its hissing voice in his dreams. And then, one night, he heard a sound outside his window. He knew that it wasn't just the wind, that something was out there, watching him. He got out of bed and made his way to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, standing in the darkness, was the creature. Its eyes burned with a malevolent light, and its mouth twisted into a familiar grin. James knew that it had come for him, that it had finally found him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but his voice was choked in his throat. He was trapped, alone with the horror that had haunted him for so many years. And then, he heard a rustling in the leaves, a whisper on the wind. He turned, and there, standing before him, was the ghost of his grandfather. The old man looked just as James remembered him, with his bushy white beard and kind eyes. He reached out and took James' hand, and James felt a surge of energy flow through him. The ghost smiled, and then he was gone, leaving James alone with the creature once more. But this time, James was ready. He raised his hands and called forth the power of the tree, and unleashed it on the creature. The creature howled, its body writhing in pain, but James didn't stop. He kept calling forth the power, pouring it into the creature until it finally collapsed, motionless. And then, the world exploded into light. James felt a surge of energy, a blinding flash that tore through the night. And when the light faded, he was alone, standing before the sacred tree once more. He knew that he had banished the darkness once and for all, that he had finally broken the curse that had haunted his family for generations. And as he made his way back to his house, he knew that he would never forget the horror that he had faced. But he also knew that he was not alone, that he had the power of his ancestors behind him, and that he would always have the strength to face the darkness. The next day, the town awoke to a bright new world. The air was fresh and clean, the sky was blue, and the birds sang in the trees. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the world, a darkness banished forever. The townspeople couldn't explain what had happened, but they knew that something had changed. They could feel it in their bones, in the very air around them. And as they went about their day, they saw something else that they couldn't explain. They saw James walking through town with a spring in his step, a smile on his face. He looked younger, more alive than they had ever seen him. And as he passed by, they could feel the power emanating from him, a force that was both ancient and new, a force that seemed to touch the very heart of the world. They knew that he had faced something terrible, something that they could only imagine in their darkest nightmares. But they also knew that he had emerged from that darkness stronger, more powerful, more alive. And as they watched him disappear down the road, they knew that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary, something that they would never forget for the rest of their days. For James had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. He had banished the darkness, and in doing so, he had saved not only himself, but the entire town. And as they went about their lives, they knew that they would always be grateful to him, always in awe of the power that he had wielded, and the courage that he had shown. For he had faced the horror, and he had won. And in doing so, he had become something more than human, something that would live on in the hearts and minds of the people he had saved forever. But for James, the victory was bittersweet. He knew that he had banished the darkness, that he had broken the curse that had haunted his family for generations. But he also knew that he could never go back to the life he had known before. The power that he had unleashed had changed him, had marked him as something different, something more. He could feel it in his bones, in the very air around him. And so, he made a decision. He knew that he couldn't stay in the town, that he couldn't go back to his old life. He had to leave, to find a new home, a new purpose. And so, he set out on a journey, traveling from town to town, from city to city, always searching for something new, something that would help him understand the power that he had unleashed. He met many people on his journey, people who had faced their own horrors, who had triumphed over their own darkness. He listened to their stories, learned from their experiences, and in doing so, he grew stronger, more powerful. And then, one day, he found himself in a small town, deep in the heart of the country. It was a quiet, peaceful place, a place that reminded him of the town he had left behind. And as he walked through the streets, he could feel the power in the air, the same power that he had unleashed so many years before. He knew that he had found his new home, his new purpose. And so, he settled in, taking up residence in a small house on the edge of town. He made friends with the locals, learned their ways, and in doing so, he became a part of the community. And as the years passed, he watched the town grow and thrive, watched as new generations of children played in the streets. He knew that he had found something that he had been searching for, something that he had thought he had lost forever. For he had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. And in doing so, he had found a new home, a new purpose, a new life. But even as James settled into his new life, he knew that the horror was never far away. He could feel its presence in the shadows, in the whispers on the wind. And so, he kept watch, always vigilant, always ready. He knew that the darkness could return at any moment, and he was determined to be ready for it. And then, one day, it came. A group of travelers had come through town, strangers with strange ways and even stranger beliefs. They had set up camp on the edge of town, and the people of the town had welcomed them with open arms. But James knew that there was something wrong. He could feel the darkness emanating from the travelers, a power that was not of this world. He knew that they had brought the horror with them, that they were here to unleash it on the world once more. And so, he went to the town council, and he warned them of the danger. But they laughed him off, dismissing his warnings as the ramblings of an old man. But James knew that he was right, and so, he took matters into his own hands. He gathered the people of the town, the ones who would listen to him, and he led them to the edge of town, to the camp of the travelers. And there, they found the horror waiting for them. The travelers had opened a portal to another world, a world of darkness and despair. And from that portal had come the creatures, the same ones that James had faced so many years before. But this time, James was ready. He called forth the power of the sacred tree, and he unleashed it on the creatures. And as he did, he could feel the power of his ancestors flowing through him, a force that was ancient and new, a force that was both terrifying and exhilarating. The creatures howled in pain, but James didn't stop. He poured more and more power into the portal, until finally it collapsed, sealing the darkness away once more. And as the town celebrated, as they cheered and embraced each other, James knew that he had once again faced the horror, and he had triumphed. He had saved the town, and in doing so, he had saved himself. For he knew that the darkness would always be there, waiting in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. But he also knew that he was ready, that he had the power to face it, and to triumph once more. As the years passed, James grew old. His hair turned gray. His face became lined with wrinkles. But his eyes remained bright and alert, always watching, always waiting. He knew that the darkness was never far away, that it could return at any moment. And so, he spent his days preparing, studying the ways of his ancestors, practicing the magic that had saved him and his town so many times before. And then, one day, he received a visitor. A young woman had come to him, a woman with a darkness inside her that she couldn't understand. She had come seeking his help, seeking the power that he wielded. And James knew that he could not turn her away, that he had a duty to help her, to guide her, to show her the way. And so, he took her under his wing, teaching her the ways of magic, showing her the power that lay within her. And as he did, he could feel the darkness within her beginning to recede, replaced by a light, a hope, a joy. And he knew that he had found a new purpose, a new reason to go on. For he had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. And in doing so, he had found a way to pass on his knowledge, to help others face their own horrors, and to triumph in turn. And as he watched the young woman leave his house, he knew that he had done what he was put on this earth to do. He had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. And in doing so, he had found a way to pass on his legacy, to ensure that his power would live on, long after he was gone. For he knew that the horror would always be there, waiting in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. But he also knew that he had passed on the power, the knowledge, the courage to face it, and to triumph in turn. And so, as he closed his eyes for the final time, he knew that his legacy would live on, that his power would continue to protect, to guide, to inspire, for generations to come. For he had faced the horror, and he had triumphed, and in doing so, he had become something more than human, something that would live on in the hearts and minds of those he had touched forever. The young woman who had sought out James continued to practice magic and learned to hone her skills. She, too, faced the horror and triumphed over it. She, in turn, taught others. And soon, James' legacy spread far and wide. His name became known to many, spoken in hushed tones as a symbol of hope, a guardian of light in a world that was dark and full of terror. And as the years passed, more and more people came seeking James' power, his knowledge, his guidance. And each time, his legacy grew stronger, his power more potent. For he had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would live on, long after he was gone. And as the world continued to spin, as the darkness continued to lurk in the shadows, James' power continued to spread, like a beacon of light in a world that was dark and full of terror. For he had faced the horror, and he had triumphed. And in doing so, he had become something more than human, something that would live on forever.